What's up, guys, and welcome back. Mike Ashworth here with another episode from the Texas Fishing Force. Now, last weekend, I spent some time down at the Got Fish Expo. I was hanging out over in the Laguna booth, helping out as much as I can, talking about rods. And, I got to meet a lot of you guys, which was absolutely great. Some of you guys came by and we talked fishing and we talked about fishing rods. And then I was asked a question by three different people, all kayakers, and the question was, is there anything, when you're looking for a fishing rod, is there anything about that rod that specifically helps you, improves kayak fishing? And the answer is yes, and we're going to talk about it. So what makes one rod better than another when it comes to kayak fishing? Well, there's a few things, but before we get into that, let me say this. I understand that rods are very much personal preference. Everybody has that one rod that they absolutely love. The action is perfect for them, for the type of fishing that they do. The castability is amazing. Everything is just perfect, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are a few things that definitely benefit you if you are fishing from a kayak, and that's what we're going to go over today. That's three specific characteristics in a fishing rod that can really help and benefit you when you're kayak fishing. Now, I know that everybody watching does different types of fishing. Some people, are into redfish, and some people are specifically trout fishermen. And then you've got guys that aren't into saltwater at all, and they're chasing those green fish around in the freshwater. And because of that, everybody's rod is going to be a little bit different. Again, a lot of that is personal preference. So we're not going to sit there and we're not going to talk about the actions of the rods, and we're not going to talk about, all of those specifics that are going to help you with specific types of fish. What we're going to talk about today is a few characteristics that are going to help while you're in a kayak, regardless of what type of fishing you do. All right, so the very first thing when you're looking for a fishing rod specifically for kayak fishing, well, it's the reel seat. Now, I'm not talking about the functionality of the reel seat or all of the fancy different types of reel seats. What I'm talking about is the distance from the reel seat to the end of the rod. See, I prefer a much shorter distance to the bottom of the reel seat. So I would absolutely go with something like this, rather than something like this. Now, there's a few reasons that you're going to want a shorter reel seat. And one of the biggest reasons is when you're in a kayak, you're in a seated position. You're in a seat. You're sitting down. You're kind of crunched up. Everything, is very, very compact on your kayak. And the reason that a shorter reel seat really, really helps is because when you're in a seated position, most of your casting is going to be from your wrist or your forearm. Unlike if you're standing up on a boat or if you're pier fishing or surf fishing, where you can really throw your entire body into it, or you can even, cast two-handed. You don't really have that option in a kayak, or it's a lot more difficult unless you're standing in the kayak, which, is another thing that I do often. But most of your casts are going to be from a seated position. A lot of my casts are one-handed, and so most of those are from my wrist and my wrist only. And so when I'm casting, I want this reel, the bottom of the rod, and when I'm holding right at the reel seat, I want this really no further than about halfway down my arm, because when I'm casting from my wrist, I don't want that hitting or getting in the way. Plus, a lot of times I'm going to be casting in a really, really tight position, and I don't want the bottom of the rod to get caught up on my life jacket or on my clothing or anything like that. So I want something really, really short that I can really whip with just my wrist and just my forearm. Now, the second reason that you do want a shorter reel seat is that when you land a fish, most of us are fishing from our chest right here. And so we're getting, because we're in a seated position, most of our leverage is going to come right here from our torso. So if we have a longer distance from our reel seat to here, that means that you have to hold the rod out further away from you rather than really getting that leverage in on your chest and get that reel and that rod as tight as you possibly can when you're fighting those fish. And the very last reason that you want a shorter reel seat is because a lot of times we bring multiple rods. And some of our rod holders that are around our kayak, some of them are behind us. So we've got some that are, a little bit further in front, depending on what kayak you're using. A shorter reel seat makes it a lot easier to get those rods into those rod holders, and you don't have to really reach up high to get them to fit and actually go down inside the rod holders. So it's just, it's a compact situation, and you definitely want to, minimize that space with a shorter reel seat. It just makes everything a lot easier for casting and for landing fish. A shorter reel seat really helps you when you're on a kayak. All right, now the second thing that you're going to want to look at when you're getting a kayak specific fishing rod is the overall length of the fishing rod. I generally stick with a 6'4" to a 6'9" fishing rod when I'm on my kayak. Now, I get it. I understand the need for a 7 foot, 7'6", 6+ rod. When you have that longer rod, you have much more leverage in your rod. You can get further casting. When you are casting single-handed or double-handed, you can flex that rod a lot further, and you can really build up that power and load that rod behind you, which, increases the power behind your cast, which increases the distance of your cast. I get it. I understand the need for all of that. Now, the reason that you're going to want to go with a shorter rod when you're on a kayak is because when you have a longer rod and you do load that up with all that power, because the rod is longer, it also flexes further when you're back behind you. And there's just a lot of stuff behind you that you can get caught up on. Like when I'm fishing, I have my power pole behind me. If I'm fishing before daybreak, then I generally have my light behind me. And when that rod is flexing a lot further, you have a much higher chance of getting hooked up and caught up on all of that stuff. When you have a shorter rod, you're avoiding some of that flex in the rod behind you. Now I get it. You're not getting as, far of a cast, with a few exceptions. Now there are some rods that are absolutely different, and I understand that as well. But on a fishing kayak, I don't really do a lot of overhand casting, and one of the biggest reasons is because of all that stuff behind me. I don't want to get caught up on my power pole. I don't want to get caught up on my cooler or anything else behind me. So I don't do a lot of overhead casting. I do a lot of side casting one-handed. I'm whipping it from the side, and that one keeps everything off to the side of me, and I have a much less chance of getting hooked up on things behind me. Beyond that, beyond the things that are inside your kayak, you also, one of the greatest benefits to having a kayak is that you can get into those small spaces, back into the marshes and back into those smaller areas. And so you have grass lines, and you've got trees, and you've got all of this stuff around you. Those longer rods, you're just going to get caught up on that a lot more, because the total distance of where the lure is traveling when you're whipping those longer rods is much further. So that is one of the reasons that you want a shorter rod, because you're just going to hook up on random things a lot less when you have a shorter rod. But the second reason, which I think is probably the most important reason that you want a shorter rod, and that is when you hook up to a fish. When you fight a fish, you're going to get that fish as close as you can to the kayak. Now, most of us, what we do is we take that rod and we put it way out behind us, and the rod is going over our heads and then across onto the opposite side of the kayak where you are landing your fish. And you want to get that as close as you possibly can. You're going to get your net and you're going to reach for it. Now, if you have a 7-foot rod, well, the distance to the end of the rod is much further, which means that fish is also further away from you. And while you're sitting in a kayak, it's a little bit hard to lean much further than the distance of your rod. And as you're leaning, the rod is also moving too. And that can also be a problem. If you can't get that fish closer, well, you're going to need a longer net. And that's one thing that some people do. But for me, I like to get that fish as close as I possibly can. So a shorter rod allows me to get that closer where I don't have to really stretch and try to reach the fish. And it's the same reason that when I am wade fishing, I also use a shorter rod. I use something like a 6'4" because it makes it easier for me to land fish in a net when I don't have as much distance to cover from a longer rod. Those are the two main reasons that I like to go with a shorter rod. Now, I get it. There are benefits to having longer rods, and You know, even for me on a popping cork, like I said before, I go with a longer rod on a popping cork setup. I did a whole video on popping corks and how to use those from a kayak and how to use those. If you want to check that out, I'll put a link above. But generally on a popping cork setup, I do go with a 7-foot, but I cast completely different. There's just an entire different setup on how I use that. Shorter rod definitely is going to help you to get caught up less with things around you on your kayak, but the biggest benefit to it is that it's a lot easier to land a fish in a net when you can get the fish closer to your body, closer to where you need to land it. All right, guys, and the last thing that you want to look for in a kayak-specific fishing rod is the weight. I'm talking about the overall physical weight of the fishing rod. You're going to want to go with a lighter rod. Now, the reason that you're going to want to go with a lighter rod is, for the most part, when you're in a kayak, you are in a seated position. So most of your casts are going to be coming from your wrist, they're going to be coming from your forearm, they're going to be coming from your shoulder. It's a very isolated muscle group that you're going to be casting, and you're going to be casting hundreds of times during the day. And it's unlike when you're standing, let's say, on a boat or just standing and fishing in general, where you can really put your whole entire body into it. When you're on a kayak, your casting is very isolated to just one section of your body. And because of that, after a few hundred casts like that, your body can, those muscles, that muscle group can get really fatigued and tired and tight. It's the same reason that when you first start using a popping cork, a lot of people by the end of the day complain about how their forearms are really, really sore and they're really, really tight. Because it's a lot more weight. It's generally a stiffer rod, and it's just, it's a lot on your muscles. Now, that lighter weight rod just allows you to cast more without getting tired, without straining your muscles or getting sore. And I know you're only talking about a few ounces for the most part, but I promise it matters after you've cast for 400, 500 times in a day. After a few hundred casts, those few ounces in a rod, it makes a huge difference. All right, guys, so that is it. Those are the 3 things that you're going to want to look for when getting a kayak-specific fishing rod, and that is the length from your reel seat to the bottom of the rod, the overall length of your rod, and the overall weight of your rod. Those 3 things will benefit you tremendously when it comes to kayak fishing. Now, I hope these tips help you on your next rod purchase, or even if you've got a lot of rods and you're trying to figure out which ones would benefit you more on a kayak. I hope this video helps. I hope the tips help. Tell me what you think. Now, this is my opinion on the things, but you may have a different opinion. You may disagree with me, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just my opinion. It's what I think really, really is beneficial on a kayak. It's what I look for in fishing rods that I'm using specifically for kayak fishing. And I hope that helps you along the way. Thank you guys for watching. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button, like the video, comment below, and we'll see you next time.